It's an honor to be here, actually, and but I'll open with, I was thinking about the line about professional, and then I'm going to tell you this little quip that doesn't quite fit. My first experience here for this conference in 2006, I had just come back from Afghanistan. I don't even think I was finished my leave. Was brought in. General Gauthier was speaking at the conference that time, and he turned to me. He was the newly appointed commander of CEFCOM at the time, one of the pre-commands to CJOC. And as we were talking out things, he turned to me and he said, "Now, Stephen, I'm going to turn to you because you can give testament to what we're talking about in Afghanistan, so don't you go to sleep on me." And as he's standing up there answering a question, he then turns to me, and now I'll call upon Colonel Bose to provide a few comments. And the first thought that I was seized of is, what was the question? So I don't know. But I have attended a number of these over the years, and I certainly applaud the efforts to bring academia and I will talk about this as a theme, all elements of our national power and all segments of society and all contributors to level the bubble and understanding of the space that we're in. I'm going to offer, how things have changed in time. I've got just a few notes, but I did want to, Queen's Alumni Review, and in it, Lieutenant Colonel Todd Allison's article's in there, among others, but an indication of the time, the cover on this thing is War and Peace. And so my compliments to those that contributed. A few years ago, we wouldn't necessarily have seen a cover like this with content like this, but it's a reflection of the times and the seriousness at which we need to retake this conversation about deterrence and about what's going on in the international community. And I would put it to you that there's an irony here, is that on the last day, my last official engagement before going back to Ottawa right after this, and getting ready for the change of command tomorrow, talking about deterrence, is I'm struck by the fact that I really would have been appreciative of doing this back in 2015. The irony is that as I look back, I'm not talking to you here today as an academic. The thoughts that I'm going to throw before you are from an operational practitioner engaged in the leading the day-to-day missions of the Canadian Armed Forces, less NORAD's piece and less our Special Forces, but the largest chunk by far. And watching as we participated in the evolution of deterrent operations in cases of focusing clearly on Russia with Latvia, Unifier in Ukraine, etc., and watching as leaders at all levels struggle to regain an understanding of the concepts relative to modern conflict today. This is where we're at. So this is, I applaud the conference organizers for choosing this theme. And the only thing is that, I wish we could have done this a while ago. And here's another vignette for you. I was a graduate student here at Queen's back in 1982, and before I went on to join the Army and the Canadian Armed Forces. And I remember at the time, at the day, we're in the 80s, it's the era of the Ronald Reagan presidency, other leaders on the international stage, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and Francois Mitterrand. And when I throw that last name out, you realize that there is for observers that recall, quite a spectrum of political views that were represented in those four very large leaders on the international stage. But one thing that they all had in common was an ability to talk about international affairs, deterrence. They could talk about strategic nuclear deterrence. They could talk about theater, the raging debate in Europe at the time, and all of that. And with the fall of the end of the Cold War, and how events have molded us over the last number of years, we lack the sophistication in our political dialogue at the highest levels, and that's not a reflection on the quality or the character of the individual, because I would argue that we share that in uniform. We share that within all segments of our society, an ability to talk about deterrence. And I'm going to put forward to you a number of themes here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context that we find ourselves in. But as I put to the challenge to the conference, it is to reinstate the debate around deterrence in 21st century version as it pertains to modern conflict. I don't use the term war, and I use that with purpose. It's about conflict. The second part is, in order to get there, there are three things that are essential to do this. One, you've got to know yourself. And I'll talk a bit about that. Two, you got to know your adversaries. And three, before you can come to a strategy to be able to have a credible deterrent posture across the spectrum, you have to have those first two nailed down. And we are lacking big time in both of those. Let me just grab my notes here for a sec. I do want to comment that I'm pleased that in the alumni review there was an article by Lieutenant Colonel Allison on deterrence, talking about the gray zone, and my only critique is you spell gray G-R-E-Y. Okay, so just let's get that straight right now. So, excellent, a short piece, 3 pages, and much is being written these days about hybrid warfare, new generation warfare, asymmetric warfare. The one criticism in all of those terms is that they use the term warfare. And it's because that our adversaries have adroitly maneuvered around that to say, we won't talk about warfare, we'll talk about conflict, because warfare brings baggage with us in Western society. Now, I have watched over the last number of years in the relationship with the combatant commanders of the United States and the leading operational commanders in Europe and our allies as the Western Alliance, not just NATO, but the group of nations that share the values of a rules-based order, that have struggled with the concept of deterrence and how best to regain a posture that actually defends society and defends those that we think are important. And one of the challenges comes with our understanding, and I put it of the space in which we're in. And so for knowing yourself, we talk about us as being a nation of laws. And every time a lawyer says that, I cringe, because I actually believe we're a nation of values. We're a nation of moral and ethical values, and we use those values to shape the laws that guide us day in and day out. When we define ourselves in terms of laws, we imply an element of rigidity in our thinking that doesn't allow us to move past to create the new laws that we need that reflect our moral and ethical values that allow us to be guided day in and day out. And so it goes with warfare. You know, I've been asked by an academic group at another university a few years ago whether we were at war in Iraq, and I said no. The reason for that's very simple, because the Prime Minister said so. And in a Western democracy, you know, that matters. But the point is we were in a conflict scenario, and as we find ourselves, a few weeks ago, I gave witness to a parliamentary committee, the same question comes up. And to me, the point is not to shy away from warfare. I actually have a slide that has about 30 or 40 different titles of the forms of warfare being conducted today in the international community. The point is that our understanding of that is limited because, or understanding the problem space is limited because of the baggage that we bring to the table. A wise mentor to me many years ago first introduced me to the concept that we are prisoners of our own experience. And with that, how we look at a problem is who we were when. And we have a difficulty in our society of updating ourselves to what's going on in the world around us. We have fallacies around Western defense policy that rely on technology, global engagement as being unnecessary, and reliance on proxies to do the work. And we have accepted this and not rolled it forward with an updated view of what is going on. And I put it to you this way. We see and perceive others through our own values. We must see others, however, as they see themselves, first order. And then we must see ourselves as others see us. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Russia, and I'm just going to use them as a case study to show you how little we actually understand what's going on in Russia and how little we actually understand how they're operating against us. And if we don't get that piece right, then we're going to have some serious problems going forward, to say nothing what we've encountered to date. But the point about understanding us first is to understand the limitations in some of the terms that we're using within society. We have a concept of warfare that is akin to the light switch on the wall, on, off, on, off. But if your adversary doesn't respect that, what does that say about your posture? What does that say about your ability to deter? We talk about whole of government, but we don't really have whole of government on anything. We talk about elements of national power, but we don't really have all elements of national power being brought to bear in any problem space. That's a very pointed, personal view. but it's a reflection not on any given country in the West. It's in fact a reflection of all of our countries in the West, the way that we're organized and how we understand the space. We would like to think that everybody in the world wants to be like us, but the reality is not everybody in the world understands us, and therefore how they view the world through their eyes is how we must see that part of the world if we're to be effective in operating in that. I first came to terms with that in Afghanistan when I saw literature that talked about us and our efforts, the international community, creating a modern pluralistic society. And I was thinking about that as I was riding in the middle of the night on the tactical reconnaissance. Actually, it was the strategic reconnaissance, I think, at that time with the U.S. patrol, and then looking at the place that I was about to move into and the space in which we were about to operate in. And I thought, how disconnected could we possibly be from the reality on the ground there versus the aspirations of what, or the expectations of what those we're talking about back home and in the Western world, as articulated by the Berlin Accord, the London Compact, or maybe I got that backwards these days, but all of that wrapped in told us we did not understand the space in which we were sending our people to operate, not just our military, but our diplomats, our aid workers, all of us. So that's part of the challenges we have, is understanding ourselves, understanding what it is we are trying to defend, what it is that we believe to be foremost of importance, and then looking at ourselves and recognizing the limitations we have. You know, one of the challenges we have, another point that I learned, is that if you want to understand your challenges, you better look in the mirror first. And we typically don't do that. There's on any given day, I remember the quote by a commander in Afghanistan, a coalition commander, that said on any given day, the main problem was weak Afghan leadership. Problem number 2 was us. Problem number 3 was the Taliban. And if you think about that and then bring it to the modern stage writ large, you could probably flip it around and say the number 1 challenge is us, our culture, and the limitations. We bring in our framework towards intellectual rigor to a problem set, baggage that is brought by our Western way of thinking. And we need to be able to take a step back, take a step sideways, and look at the problem afresh before and then we can re-engage. There's an incredible richness with how we view the world, but at the same moment, we need to understand the space and what's going on. And I've begun to see that already in current operations and operational environments where I think we'll be involved in the years ahead. So let me sum it up with one comment, and then I'll move on to the next phase, which is a quote that Vladimir Putin made to then Vice President Joe Biden, I think around 2008. "We are not like you, we just look like you." And I've reflected on that on many occasions over the years. That kind of sums up the approach that we have and they have that hinders us and enables them. When I look at the challenge of deterrence for the 21st century and understanding modern conflict, the term I like to use is what the Russians use themselves. They do not use hybrid warfare, asymmetric warfare. They use generational conflict. That's not a very good translation from what the Russian term is, but it works for us. In other words, it's the conflict of the generation. And they understand that all elements of national power are in play across the spectrum on any given day, regardless of where you're at in the world. Everything is global and everything is linked. There is nothing that is isolated. And therefore, we can't make the assumption of isolation. We can't deal with the problem of Russia and Syria without understanding Latvia concurrently and North Korea. And if you do that, you're just moving into a problem set with blinders. We like to use the term 4+1 to discuss the problem set in the Western world, and that's dominated by the United States, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations as being the +1. I have made the point to my colleagues that I find that limiting, because what it does is it applies a Westphalian or a modern state construct to the problem set rather than how we're actually seeing the threat being played out on the world stage, and therefore we need to take a step back. Before I do that, I want to actually introduce another quote by Lieutenant General retired H.R. McMaster, who many of us have had the pleasure of serving with in previous appointments prior to him becoming the National Security Advisor. And years ago, he wrote about, as a result of Gulf War I, there are 2 ways to fight the United States, and therefore the West, asymmetrically and stupid. And the point was that as he was making that conversational point is that the dominance of Western military power was leading us to a view that we would be able to overmatch in any conflict scenario. However, our adversaries were not stupid, and so that they studied the weaknesses in the West and developed the strategies that they bring forward to this day. And as a consequence, when you look at how and study how Russia operates on the international stage, or Iran, or any one of the other adversaries, and I will move past the traditional state construct to talk about trans-criminal organizations as well in just a second, let alone the violent extremist organizations, at the end of the day, they have studied the West well, and they understand the weaknesses in our approach to the application of national power. I have a question I want you to think about. Why is it that a country like Russia, with 2/3 of the population of the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, with a gross domestic product of about 20 to 25% of those three countries alone, not including the United States, Canada, and the rest of the NATO allies, is able to cause, to wreak such havoc on the international stage and interfere with Western democracies and challenge the rules-based order? What is it about how they operate that enables them to have such an influence on us? And if you haven't thought of that before, then I would argue that that's probably the first place you need to begin with, is begin thinking about how it is, how it is they were able to bring their elements of national power together. I'm not going to give a long lecture here on my understanding of that space. There are many great works out there. A better work that I have read many, but a better work is one that I ended up making some notes out of and sharing with some GoFos recently, but it was by Stephen Covington, The Culture of Strategic Thought Behind Russia's Modern Approaches to Warfare, that he wrote in 2016. I've never met Stephen Covington, but I know people who have, and that's just one view. But that one view brings, in 40 pages, brings together the challenge space better than anywhere as I've ever read in that short piece of, that short paper. And I would highly recommend it as a way of bringing forward an understanding of how they operate. Russia, as an example, I view as graduate students, if not doctoral students, in whole of government operations where we're just begun university. And that puts it into perspective as I see that space. They have studied Western weakness very well. They have studied strengths. And as they have begun to rebuild their conventional forces and strategic nuclear forces, they have done it on an asymmetric basis, designed to take advantage of Western weakness. And so for you to have a credible deterrent posture, and although I'm using Russia as an example, I by no means identifying Russia here as the singular threat. I'm simply saying that as one example of a nation that is out there that is maneuvering against Western values in the rules-based order, that if we don't understand how they're doing it and how they are able, what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are, we will never be able to define a credible deterrent posture in ways that they understand that we mean business. We've seen through Russia clearly the weaponization of information. And when we talk about domains of warfare, one of the themes that I have repeatedly tackled with our officers in the Canadian Armed Forces is we have a sense of jointness as being air, land, air, sea, or something like that. But being a joint warrior today means being all domain. It means air, land, and sea, but it also means understanding cyber space and the informational domain. Some of our allies don't recognize information as a separate domain, but it is in fact, in my view, coming forward at such speed, but yet we are still talking about information in the ways that we spoke about cyber in the 1990s. We are well behind the game, and we have a long ways to come to close that gap in understanding how adversaries are used in the informational domain. It is not just Russia. It's how, as an example, Iran might use it on a regional basis in the Middle East. It's also how China plays within their near abroad. We need to understand that and be able to develop the kind of counters to that create a credible deterrent posture. But the Russian view of generational conflict is anchored by the concepts of political subversion, proxy sanctuary, coercive deterrence, negotiated manipulation, and intervention. And if we're, as a military professional, you're hearing that for the first time, then it anchors the thought that we have a lot of work to do within the community of those in uniform to understand what's going on and how our platform may be called upon to aid our strategic leadership in society writ large, not just at a political level, but society writ large to defend our democracies. I want to talk about a couple of things as well. And something that I have seen in our missions that is, I find deeply disturbing. We used to speak in the past about transcriminal organizations, the big narcotics cartels, et cetera, as a law enforcement issue off on the side. We might get involved to help support, but that's something that's off on the side. That's their problem to tackle. We would talk about violent extremist organizations and say, well, our security services and maybe our special forces, that's their problem to solve. And then we would talk about malign actors in the same context, the same way, and others got to deal with those and how they're operating in the stage. Well, over the last number of years, those three separate bubbles have converged to a point that we need to take note of how the threat vector, the alignment of those threat vectors is threatening our society. And a deterrent posture going forward, my point on this, is arguably one that is all domain. And what it means to me when I say that is that it just can't be about military deterrence in a strategic or conventional sense. We've got to think about all elements of national power. The U.S. uses the term DIME, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. Whatever the term you wish to use, that's the heart of deterrence going forward. Because what it means to us is that I watch transcriminal organizations with economic clout that far exceeds most of the nations in the Western Hemisphere, but for whom violent extremist organizations are actually aiding and abetting because you can't be a good violent extremist if you don't have money. It's all about economics. And at the same time, malign actors are aiding and abetting because this is one way to erode Western society and the values. Remember, for those of us that served in Afghanistan, there may have been a drug problem in Afghanistan, but it wasn't really Afghanistan's drug problem. The drug problem was in the West. We were the drug problem. That was simply another commodity for the local farmers of the day. So understanding that space and understanding what's being played out is essential to developing a deterrent posture. I guess I want to sum up right now with a couple of thoughts on the effectiveness of deterrence when I talk all domains. I'm not suggesting for 1 second that the military is preeminent in this discussion. In fact, if I were to use military nomenclature, where as an example, to give you an example here, I am a supporting commander to Commander NORAD. And NORAD commanders' concept that their duties, CJOC would support them in their mission. I'm a fellow COCOM in the instance with NORTHCOM. But I see the military in all of this as supporting other elements of society and enabling them to develop the appropriate measures to have an effective deterrent posture. It's about developing, it's recognizing that the concepts of national security and national defense that we used to keep separate through the Cold War have effectively blurred to the point where you cannot recognize a boundary between the two. There has been such an assault on the Westphalian state construct that with a threshold of conflict below what we describe in the linear concept of war, that unless we enable elements of civil society to be able to raise their game, we are going to be challenged going forward. You know, people use the term grand strategy, and I realize that term itself comes with baggage. And people would suggest that, well, Canada can't have a grand strategy. I'm not in that camp. I don't think that any nation, you can say, cannot have a grand strategy. It may be different and may look different and be fundamentally based differently than another element. But at the end of the day, we've watched just in recent memory here how political parties have rallied around one leadership. So what are those issues that all Canadians rally around to say that defines us? If we don't have that conversation first, and we don't have that conversation with those that share our values and rally around that, we're not going to have an effective deterrent posture against the generational conflict that is playing out in front of us at this very moment. So, know what you stand for, what you want, what your vision is, and what you are willing to do to defend it. And that's the essence of developing an effective deterrent strategy. Discussion deterrence is first and foremost a journey into knowing yourself, a journey into knowing your adversary, and without those two, you can't identify effective strategies to negate the threat and have a credible deterrent posture. I think I'll hold it there within the context. I think I've spoken enough, and I'm not sure whether it was time for questions or whether I give you the gift of time in the conference. As I close, though, I again wish you very well. I wish we could do, I was having dinner, at the gathering last night. Didn't have dinner, but the gathering, and I was talking with General Cadden, and I made the comment is that we have a few of these across the country to greater or lesser extent. This is one of the greater conferences of the like that we have out there that bring the military and academia together, along with other elements, journalists, political leadership, diplomats, etc. We're probably not where we need to be in terms of the number and the quality across the country to have this kind of dialogue. And again, I hark back to the discussions of the 1980s. It wasn't perfect then by any means, but I would simply suggest there was a greater understanding of what deterrence was about by more members of our society than what we presently have today. Thank you very much.